However, the danger increasing every moment, General Leclerc sent an aide-de-camp to the residence, who was enjoined in case of a new refusal on the part of Pauline to take her on board in spite of herself. The officer was obliged to execute this order strictly. Madame Leclerc was held by force in an armchair carried by 4 soldiers. A grenadier marched at her side with the son of his general in his arms, enduring this scene of flight and terror. The child, already worthy of his mother, played with his conductor's plume, followed by her cortege of women, all trembling and in tears, of whom her courage was the only rampart on this dangerous transit. Pauline was transported in this way as far as the seashore. But just as they were about to put her in the boat, another of her husband's aides brought her news of the defeat of the blacks. "You see," said she as they were returning to the house, "I was right in not wishing to embark." Still, she was not yet entirely out of danger. A troop of Negroes belonging to the army, which had just been so miraculously repulsed and seeking to effect their retreat among the piers, met the feeble escort of Madame Leclerc. The insurgents seemed to be intending to attack them. They had to be driven off by muskets fired in their very faces. Pauline maintained an imperturbable presence of mind in the midst of this affray. All these circumstances were, of course, reported to the first consul. His self-love was flattered by them, and I think it was to the Prince Borghese that he said one day at his levee, "Pauline was predestined to espouse a Roman, for she is all Roman, from head to foot." Unhappily, this courage, which a man might have envied her, was not accompanied in the Princess Pauline by those less brilliant and more modest virtues which are nevertheless more necessary to a woman, and more rightfully expected of her, than audacity and indifference to danger. I do not know whether it is true, as has been written somewhere, that Madame Leclerc had an affection for an actor of the Théâtre Français at the time she was obliged to go to Santo Domingo. Neither can I say whether Mademoiselle Duchesnois did really have the naivete to exclaim in the presence of 100 persons apropos of this departure, "Lafont will never be consoled for it. He is capable of dying on account of it." But what I personally knew of the frailties of this princess would easily incline me to believe this anecdote. All Paris knew the particular favor with which she honored Monsieur Jules de Canouville, a young and brilliant colonel of great bravery, perfect figure, and a recklessness which gained him innumerable successes with certain women, although he employed very little discretion with them. The Princess Pauline's liaison with this amiable officer was the most durable that she ever formed. Unfortunately, neither of them was at all reserved, and their mutual affection soon acquired a scandalous publicity. Later, I shall have occasion to relate, in its own place, the adventure which caused the disgrace, banishment, and perhaps the death of Colonel de Canouville. The whole army deplored his death, so premature and above all so cruel, because it was not by an enemy's bullet that he was struck. Yet whatever may have been the weakness of the Princess Pauline for her lovers, and although such incredible examples of it may be cited, without departing from truth, her admirable devotion to the person of His Majesty the Emperor in 1814 should cause her faults to be treated with indulgence. 100 times had the heedlessness of her conduct, and especially her failure in attention and respect towards the Empress Marie-Louise, irritated the Emperor against the Princess Borghese. He always ended by forgiving her. Still, at the time of her august brother's fall, she was again in disgrace. On being informed that the island of Elba had been assigned as a prisoner to the Emperor, she hastened to shut herself up there with him, abandoning Rome and Italy, whose most beautiful palaces belonged to her. At the critical period before the Battle of Waterloo, His Majesty found the heart of his sister Pauline faithful. Fearing that he might need money, she sent him her richest diamond ornaments, the price of which was enormous. They were found in the carriage of the Emperor, which was taken at Waterloo and exposed to the curiosity of the inhabitants of London. But the diamonds have been lost, at least to their legitimate owner. Chapter 14. The first consul was in a state of great agitation on the day of General Moreau's arrest. All the morning his emissaries and the agents of the police were going and coming. Measures had been taken so that the arrest should be made at the same hour, whether at Grosbois or at the general's residence. In the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré. The first consul was anxiously walking up and down in his chamber. He had me called and ordered me to go and station myself in front of the general's Paris house to observe whether the arrest was made and if there were any tumult, and to come back quickly and report to him. I obeyed, but nothing extraordinary was passing in the house, and I saw nobody but some police spies strolling in the street and keeping an eye on the door of the dwelling inhabited by the man who had been designated as their prey. My presence might have been noticed, so I departed, and on my way back to the chateau, I learned that General Moreau had been arrested on the road as he was returning to Paris from Gros Bois, which he sold a few months later to Marshal Berthier before starting for the United States. I quickened my pace and ran to announce the tidings of the arrest to the first consul. He knew it already and made me no reply. He was still pensive and dreamy, as he had been in the morning. As I have been led to speak of General Moreau, I will recall the fatal circumstances by which he was impelled to tarnish his fame. Madame Bonaparte had married him to Mademoiselle Hulot, her friend, and like herself a Creole of the Ile of France. This young person, sweet, amiable, and full of the qualities which make a good wife and mother, loved her husband passionately. She was proud of that glorious name which surrounded her with respect and honors, but unfortunately, she had the greatest deference for her mother, who was very ambitious and desired nothing less than to behold her daughter seated on a throne. Her empire over Madame Moreau soon included the general himself, who, ruled by her counsels, became somber, dreamy, melancholy, and lost forever that tranquility of mind which had distinguished him. From that time, the general's house was open to plots and intrigues. All the malcontents, and there were many of them, met each other there. From that time, the general undertook to disapprove all the acts of the first consul. He opposed the reestablishment of public worship. He called the institution of the Legion of Honor a piece of childish and ridiculous mummery. These grave imprudences and plenty of others soon reached, as may readily be believed, the ears of the first consul, who at first refused to credit them. But how could he remain deaf to insinuations that daily returned with increased force and were doubtless envenomed by malice? Now, while the imprudent speeches of the general were contributing to ruin him in the mind of the first consul, his mother-in-law, with dangerous obstinacy, encouraged him in his opposition, persuaded, as she said, that the future would do justice to the present. She was not aware how truly she spoke. The general rushed headlong into the abyss which opened in front of him. How altogether contrary was his conduct to his character! He had a decided aversion for the English. He detested the Chouans and all that pertained to the old nobility. Besides, a man like General Moreau, after having served his country so gloriously, was not made to carry arms against her. But he was misled, and he misled himself, in thinking that he was fit to play a great political role. He was ruined by the flattery of a party which raised as many enmities as it could against the first consul by exciting the jealousy of his former companions in arms. I have seen more than one token of affection given by the first consul to General Moreau during one of the latter's visits to the Tuileries, and while he was conversing with the first consul, General Carnot came in from Versailles with a pair of very elaborately wrought pistols presented to the first consul by the manufactory of Versailles. To take these two beautiful weapons from the hands of General Carnot, to examine them a moment, and then to offer them to General Moreau, saying, "Keep them. They could not come more apropos." Oh, that was done quicker than I can write it. The general could not have been more flattered by this proof of friendship, and he warmly thanked the first consul. The name and the trial of General Moreau remind me of the story of a brave officer who found himself compromised in this unhappy affair and barely extricated himself from it after several years of disgrace by dint of the courage with which he ventured to expose himself to the emperor's wrath. The authenticity of the details I am going to give can be attested at need by living persons whom I shall have occasion to name in my recital, and whose testimony no reader would dream of rejecting. General Moreau's disgrace at first extended to all who were connected with him. The affection and devotion borne him by the army men, whether officers or soldiers who had served under him, was well known. His aides-de-camp were arrested, even those who were not in Paris. One of these, Colonel de Lelay, had been several months at Besançon on furlough, reposing from his campaigns in the bosom of his family, along with a young wife to whom he had not long been married, but occupying himself very little with political affairs, a good deal with his pleasures, and not at all with conspiracies. The comrade and the brother in arms of Colonels Guillaume, Minon, Hugo, and Foy, all three of whom afterwards became generals. He spent joyous evenings with them in garrison and agreeable ones at home. All at once, Colonel de Lelay was arrested, thrown into a post-chaise, and it was only when they were rolling at a gallop on the road to Paris that he learned from the officer of the gendarmerie who accompanied him that General Moreau had conspired, and that in his capacity as aide-de-camp of the general, he was included among the conspirators. On arriving in Paris, the colonel was put into close custody at La Force. I think his wife, justly alarmed, hastened in pursuit of him, but it was not until after a great many days that she obtained permission to communicate with the prisoner, and even then she could do so only by signs. She would remain in the court of the prison while he would show himself for some moments and pass his hand through the bars of his window. However, the rigor of these orders was abated for the colonel's son, a little child of 3 or 4 years old. His father obtained the favor of embracing him. He came every morning in his mother's arms, and a turnkey would take him to the prisoner. In presence of this troublesome witness, the poor little fellow would play his part with all the cunning of a consummate dissimulator. He would pretend to be lame and complain that there were grains of sand in his shoes that hurt him. The colonel, turning his back on the jailer, would take the child on his knee to rid him of what troubled him and find in the shoe a note from his wife apprising him in very few words of the progress of the legal inquiry and what he had to hope or fear on his own account. At last, after several months of captivity, sentence having been passed on the conspirators, Colonel de Lelay, against whom no accusation had been brought, was not absolved, as he had a right to expect, but struck off the army rolls and arbitrarily sent away under surveillance and forbidden to come within 40 leagues of Paris. At first, he was also enjoined not to return to Besançon, and it was not until he had been out of prison for a year that he was permitted to live there. Young and full of courage, the colonel beheld from the depths of his retreat his friends and comrades making their way and gaining name, rank, and glory on the field of battle. He saw himself condemned to inaction and obscurity. He spent his days in following on the maps of the triumphant march of those armies in which he felt that he deserved to resume his rank. 1,000 requests were addressed by him and his friends to the chief of the empire that he would permit him to go merely as a volunteer to join his former comrades, where with a knapsack on his back. His prayers were rejected. The emperor's will was inflexible, and every new application he answered let him wait. The inhabitants of Besançon, who considered Colonel de Lelay their compatriot, interested themselves keenly in the misfortune of this brave officer. An occasion presented itself to recommend him anew to the clemency, or rather to the justice, of the emperor, and they profited by it. This was, I think, on the return from the campaign of Prussia and Poland. Deputations were coming from all parts of France, charged to congratulate the emperor on his new victories. Colonel de Lelay was unanimously elected a member of the deputation from Doubs, of which the mayor and the prefect of Besançon formed part, and which was presided over by the worthy Marshal M. An occasion then is at last offered to Colonel de Lelay to have the long interdict raised, which has weighed upon his head and kept his sword idle. He will speak to the emperor. He will complain respectfully, but with dignity, of the motiveless disgrace in which he has been detained for so long. He will render heartfelt thanks to the generous affection of his fellow citizens, whose suffrages will, he hope, plead in his favor with his majesty. The Besançon deputies, on their arrival in Paris, have themselves presented to the different ministers. The minister of police takes a president of the deputation aside and asks him what signifies the presence among the deputies of a man publicly known to be in disgrace, and the sight of whom cannot fail to be disagreeable to the chief of the empire. On issuing from this private interview, Marshal M. enters, pale and terrified, the apartment of Colonel de Lillay. All is lost, my friend. I see by the looks of things at the bureau that they are still ill-disposed towards you. If the Emperor sees you amongst us, he will take that foreign express intention to go against his orders, and he will be furious. Ah, well, what can I do about that? But to avoid compromising the department, the deputation, to avoid compromising yourself, you might well, perhaps, the Marshal hesitates. I should do well? Asks the Colonel. Perhaps by withdrawing without making any scandal. Here the Colonel interrupted the President of the deputation. Marshal, permit me to refuse this counsel. I did not come so far in order to recoil like a child before the first obstacle. I am tired of a disgrace I have not deserved. Still more tired of my idleness. Whether the Emperor is angry or is appeased, he will see me. Let him have me shot if he likes. I do not cling to a life such as I have led for the last 4 years. However, Marshal, I will submit to what shall be decided by my colleagues, the deputies of Besançon. These latter did not disapprove of the Colonel's resolution. He went with them to the Tuileries on the day of the formal reception of all the deputations of the Empire. Every hall in the Tuileries was encumbered by a crowd in richly embroidered coats and brilliant uniforms. The military household of the Emperor, his civil family, the generals present in Paris, the diplomatic corps, the ministers and chiefs of the different administrations, the deputies of the departments with their prefects, and their mayors decorated with tricolored scarfs, all were assembled in innumerable groups and were waiting the arrival of His Majesty, talking meanwhile in undertones. In one of these groups was seen a tall officer dressed in a very simple uniform and of a fashion which dated several years back. He did not wear either in his neck or on his breast the decoration which at that time no officer of his grade was without. It was Colonel de Lillay. The president of the deputation of which he formed part seemed embarrassed and almost afflicted. The former comrades of the colonel hardly dared to recognize him. The most adventurous gave him a little nod from a distance, which expressed both anxiety and pity. The most prudent did not look at him at all. As for him, he remained impassive and resolute. At last, a folding door flew open, and an usher cried, "The Emperor, gentlemen!" The groups broke up. People ranged themselves in 2 rows. The colonel placed himself in the first rank. His Majesty began to turn around the salon. He addressed remarks to the president of each deputation and said to every one of them some flattering words. Arriving in front of the deputation of dupes, the Emperor, after having said a few words to the brave marshal who conducted it, was about to pass on to others when his eyes fell upon an officer whom he had never seen. He stopped in surprise and addressed his familiar question to the deputy. "Who are you?" "Sire, I am Colonel de Lillay, formerly first aide-de-camp of General Moreau." These words were uttered in a steady voice which resounded through the profound silence commanded by the presence of the sovereign. The Emperor drew back a step and fixed both eyes upon the colonel. The latter did not flinch before this glance, but he bowed slightly. Marshal M. was as pale as a dead man. The Emperor resumed, "What do you come to ask for here?" "What I have asked for years, sire, that your Majesty would deign to tell me of what I am guilty, or else restore me to my rank." Among those who were near enough to hear these questions and answers, there were not many who could breathe freely. At last a smile parted the Emperor's tightly closed lips. He lifted a finger to his mouth as he approached the colonel and said to him in an almost friendly tone, "People have complained a little of that, but don't say any more about it." And he went on his way. He had hardly gone 10 steps beyond the group formed by the deputies of Besançon when he came back, and stopping opposite the colonel, "Mr. Minister of War," said His Majesty, "take the name of this officer and take care to remind me of it. He is tired of doing nothing. We will give him some occupation." As soon as the audience was over, it was who should get to the colonel quickest. They surrounded him, they congratulated him, they embraced him, they tore him away from each other. All of his former companions wanted to take him away with them. His hand could not grasp all the hands extended to him. General S., who only the day before had still further increased the alarms of Marshal M., by expressing his astonishment that anyone should have had the audacity to come and brave the Emperor in this way, stretched his arm above the shoulders of those who were pressing around the colonel and shaking hands with him in the most cordial way in the world. "De Lillay," he cried, "don't forget that I expect you to breakfast tomorrow." 2 days after this court scene, de Lelay received his appointment as Chief of Staff of the Army of Portugal, commanded by the Duke de Brantes, Juno. His equipments were soon ready, and at the moment of departing, he had a final audience of the Emperor, who said to him, "Colonel, I know it is needless to urge you to make up for lost time. Before long, I hope we shall be quite content with each other." On coming out from this last audience, the brave de Lelay said that all he lacked now to make him happy was a good occasion to have himself cut to pieces for a man who knew so well how to close the wounds of a long disgrace. Such was the empire of His Majesty exercised over men's minds. The colonel had soon crossed the Pyrenees. He went through Spain and was received by Juno with open arms. The army of Portugal had had much to suffer during the 2 years it had been fighting against the population and against the English with unequal forces. They were badly supplied with provisions, the soldiers ill-clothed and not well shod. The new chief of staff did all in his power to remedy this disorder, and the soldiers began to be sensible of his presence. When he fell sick from overwork and fatigue, he died before having, to use the emperor's expression, made up for lost time. I have said elsewhere that on every conspiracy against the life of the first consul, all the persons of his household were naturally subjected to close surveillance. Their least proceedings were watched. They were followed when outside the chateau. Their conduct was inspected in its most minute details. At the time when the Pichegru plot was discovered, there was only one keeper of the portfolio, named Landois, and his place was therefore one of the most difficult, because he could never go away from a little dark corridor on which the door of the cabinet opened, and he ate his meals running and almost on the sly. Luckily for Landois, they gave him a second, and on this occasion, Ogel, one of the palace porters, was designated by the first consul to go and establish himself at the barrier des Bonshommes during Pichegru's trial in order to reconnoitre the unobserved domestics of the house as they came and went about their service, nobody being allowed to leave Paris without permission. Augel's reports pleased the first consul. He had him summoned, seemed satisfied with his answers and his intelligence, and appointed him as substitute for Landois in keeping the portfolio. Thus the task of the latter became easier by half. Ogel went on the Russian campaign, and in 1802, and he died on the return when he was only a few leagues from Paris in consequence of the fatigues and privations which we shared with the army. However, it was not merely the servants attached to the household of the first consul who found themselves subjected to this regime of surveillance. From the time he became emperor, he established among the concierges of the imperial palaces a register on which people from outside and strangers who came to visit anyone within were obliged to inscribe their names and that of the persons they came to see. Every evening this register was carried to the grand marshal of the palace, or in his absence to the governor, and the emperor often consulted it. He once read there a name which, in his capacity as husband, he had his reasons, and perhaps even reason, for suspecting. His Majesty had previously ordered the absence of this person. Hence, on meeting this unlucky name again on the concierge's book, he was beside himself with rage, believing that both sides had dared to disobey his orders. Information was sought for on the spot, and it turned out very luckily that the suspected visitor was merely a very insignificant person whose only fault was that of bearing a name justly compromised. Chapter 15. The year 1804 was so glorious for the emperor was also, with the exception of 1814 and 1815, that which brought him the most vexations. It does not belong to me to judge of such grave events, nor to examine what part the emperor took in them, nor who are those who surrounded and counsel him. I ought not and cannot recount anything but what I saw and heard. March 21st of that year, I entered the first consul's chamber very early. I found him awake, his elbow leaning on his pillow. He looked somber and fatigued. On seeing me come in, he sat up, passed his hand several times across his forehead, and said, "Constant, I have a headache." Then, jerking off the bedclothes, he added, "I have slept badly." He could not have seemed more preoccupied and absorbed. He even had a sad and suffering air which surprised and affected me. While I was dressing him, he did not say a word to me, a thing that never happened, except when some thought disturbed or tormented him. There was nobody in his chamber with him but Rustem and me. At the moment when, his toilet being finished, I was handing him his snuff-box handkerchief and bonbonniere. The door suddenly opened, and we saw the wife of the first consul appear in her mourning gown, her features drawn, and her face covered with tears. This sudden apparition astonished and even alarmed us, that is to say, Rustam and me, because there was only one extraordinary circumstance which could induce Madame Bonaparte to leave her room in this costume, and before having taken all necessary precautions to disguise the ravages usually hidden by the toilet, she entered, or rather she rushed into the chamber crying, "The Duc d'Enghien is dead! Ah, my friend, what have you done?" Then she fell sobbing into the first consul's arms. He became as pale as death and said with extraordinary emotion, "The wretches have been too quick." Then he went out, supporting Madame Bonaparte, who could scarcely walk and continued to weep. The news of the prince's death spread consternation throughout the chateau. The first consul remarked in this universal grief, and yet he reproached nobody. The fact is that the greatest chagrin which this fatal catastrophe caused to his servitors, who for the most part were attached to him still more by affection than by duty, sprang from the thought that it could not fail to detract from the glory and tranquility of their master. The first consul probably knew how to interpret our sentiments, however they may be. This is all I saw and all I heard in private of this deplorable event. I do not pretend to know what passed in the interior of the cabinet. The first consul's emotion seemed to be sincere and not affected. He remained sad and silent for several days, speaking very little at his toilette, and only when necessity required.